Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our virtual roundtable event. During this event, we will cover the topic of best practices for establishing and scaling employee resource groups. My name is Douglas Brown, CEO at Halo Consulting. Halo is a certified minority-owned search firm based in Chicago, and we provide a variety of custom, scalable, talent-driven solutions for organizations in growth mode. Halo was founded to provide the process-oriented best practices our team developed at the top executive search firms, along with the cost-conscious scrappiness that you'd expect from a boutique or startup. Halo hosts virtual roundtable events like this one for HR and technology leaders on a variety of topics, and we hope you'll be interested in attending our future events. This event is being recorded, and feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A function in the toolbar, and we will address those questions at the end of the webinar. We will be sharing a survey at the end of our event to gather your feedback, and we will have a recorded version of this event available on YouTube. For now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. The first speaker I'd like to introduce, her name is Theresa Jones. Theresa Jones serves as the Vice President of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Strategies for Children's Wisconsin. Theresa has served in this role since January of 2020, where she was focused on developing ID&E strategies that focus on improving care and health outcomes for children and families in Wisconsin. Her background includes over 20 years of experience in human resources and organizational leadership. Prior to her role at Children's, she served as the CMO of a nonprofit, VP of Diversity and Inclusion Strategies at Wheaton Franciscan Healthcare, and has worked in the academic, financial services, and air express industries in similar HR leadership roles. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Shelli Green. Shelli Green serves as the Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Vectrus. Appointed to this role in 2020, she is responsible for providing leadership to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion as a strategic priority. She joined Vectrus in 2010 and leveraged progressive experience in project management to strengthen the organization's commitment to inclusion as a business strategy. She earned a master's degree with a distinction in project management from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and a bachelor's degree from Florida A&M University. The next panelist I'd like to introduce, her name is Kristen Bailey. Kristen has been a certified inclusion strategist for Getting Hired, an Allegis Group company, for about 5 years. Within her role, Kristen consults with organizations to help them become more inclusive employers through her innovative work around implementing inclusive hiring initiatives, retention programs and practices, as well as providing educational content and intercultural training. Kristen is also responsible for outreach to and management of multiple national community partnerships with nonprofits, colleges, and universities to support all diversity communities and their inclusivity in the workplace. And the last panelist I'd like to introduce, her name is Roshawn Ceja. Roshawn is a Navy veteran with over 11 years of experience working on veteran hiring and education initiatives. She is currently an onboarding manager at Zillow Group, where she also served as Zillow's first veteran Affinity network president for 2 years. Before joining Zillow, she worked at Microsoft as their first operation program manager for the Microsoft Software and System Academy program. Prior to Microsoft, she was a military liaison for Ashford University, supporting all military bases and veteran organizations across the Northwest and Alaska. We'll kick it off with the first question with you, Kristen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So the first question, Kristen, can you share with the audience what the differences between employee resource groups, business resource groups, and affinity networks, and why they are beneficial to your organization?
So while the terms are now often used interchangeably and have similar objectives, historically, affinity groups and employee networks were more informal, self-appointed, and employee-led based on shared diversity identities. ERGs were a little more structured. They focus more on education and influence within the organization, and while still being employee-led, they actually have the added support of an executive sponsor. BRGs are integrated into the business plan of an organization. They're typically funded by the D&I budget, and they're pulled into conversations and plans around business development, internal recruiting and retention solutions. I personally believe all are beneficial to organizations because they bring together employees with similar backgrounds or interests that may not have the opportunity to connect otherwise. But it also shows an organization's inclusivity. It increases cultural competence. It's an opportunity to educate employees, including leadership. And one of my favorite things about these groups is that they actually identify and develop employees as internal leaders by providing them visibility and access to leadership. Every employee within my organization that has stepped up to assist in running or organizing an ERG, including myself, has actually been promoted within the last 2 years.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Theresa, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I think Kristen did a great job of describing all of them. We use terminology like inclusion resource groups because we lead with inclusion. But to Kristen's point, we are kind of shifting. I think they started with a focus on connectivity. And now we're really trying to shift it to more of how can they really help us provide better care for our populations? How can we be more inclusive? You know, how can they educate around that and engage our staff in those kinds of activities? We've got a gender clinic. So looking at how can they really enhance the services of that clinic. So I think this is our going into the second year. So I think you have to start sometimes with that connectivity and then shift them now to more of that business focus as well.
Great, thanks, Theresa. Roshawn, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you both so much. So within my company, we actually call our networks affinity networks. However, they're built and structured like BRGs, which basically we ran into some issues with that because while we're structured like a BRG, when it came to decision making and being included in decisions, we were treated more like an affinity network. So that's definitely something you want to think about when you're building out your ERGs is what type of influence are you looking for? Are you looking to actually include those that are part of these ERGs in your decision making, in your planning, and how you are actually going to meet the needs of not just your internal employees, but those of your customers, and really determine what you would like to see. So are you looking just for an affinity network where it's more along the lines of almost, I don't want to say a club, but it can look a bit more like a club, or are you actually looking for some real change within the company?
Great, thanks, Roshawn. We're going to hop into the next question, and Shelli, I'll pass you the mic. When and how was it determined that it was time to establish an ERG, a BRG, and/or an affinity network at your organization, and where do you start?
So normally ERGs or BRGs are tied to a strategic action for a company's diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. And most organizations determine that it's time to start the ERG or BRG when an external entity comes in and provides feedback that one is needed, or their team members are surveyed and the results basically show that there's a need for change in the organization's culture. It could also be that the culture or lack of diversity is impacting the business performance, and customers are wary of continuing to do business with the organization. So then there's that immediate need to make sure that we have that involvement from our team. Another reason could be directly related to something globally impactful. So for example, last year's global anti-racism protests or the pandemic, which changed the way coworkers interacted as a team. For my organization, this was something that we were already on a journey on for over 4 years, and everything increased, the momentum increased, especially when things started to change around us. And as a global company, we had to adjust much faster than we had anticipated. And we made sure that when we started our ERGs, we were strategic in creating and initiating 5 from the very start.
Great, thanks, Shelli. Theresa, would you like to add anything?
Sure. Shelli pointed out kind of how that strategic focus on the front end can make a difference. And at Children's, when I came, they had already determined that they wanted to have inclusion resource groups. Our senior leadership team had benchmarked with other organizations here locally to find out how they had actually started them and how they were to be used. So it really made my job a lot easier in that I didn't have to actually do the justification because they were already supportive. What I do think emerged, though, is they weren't quite sure what they were supposed to do. So now that we've got them up and running, it's really honing in now on their purpose and how we can really align them more to business needs. We also reached out right away to our senior leaders to ask them to be sponsors because we knew that if we were talking about business alignment, you know, that they would be key to kind of removing those challenges and those barriers. So in starting them up, we started them with a sponsor so that they could kind of help open the doors and align them to business. And of course, we're only about, 8 months in our first year, but finding that need to tweak as we kind of lay out that next 3-year plan. So I think being intentional on the front end with what's their purpose, how you want to align them can really help set it up much better for success as well.
I also agree with something that Shelli mentioned. If you're an employer, I would suggest actually including questions in an employment engagement survey to see if there's actually enough interest. And then also tapping people leaders to suggest employees who they think may want to be involved or help run those groups. And even thinking from an employee perspective, if you're an employee and you want to start an ERG, if there are other ERGs that already exist, I feel like there's no need to reinvent the wheel. I would just reach out to HR or someone in the diversity and inclusion office to start a charter application to kind of outline the mission and the purpose of the group that you guys would want to start.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Let's move on to the next question. What steps and/or stakeholders are often overlooked when forming an ERG, BRG, or an Affinity network group? Theresa, do you want to kick off this question?
Sure, Doug. I think one of the things, and I'm not sure if it's happened in some of your organizations, but we found when we initially went out to solicit members for the IRGs, we had more allies than we did have members of the actual group. And part of it, as we kind of got underneath why that was the case, was because last year people wanted to help. After all the things that were happening around racism, they really wanted to help. And so I think initially some of our individuals of color in the organization felt like, well, why would I want to join this group? Because there's more allies here. But allies can sometimes help open doors that IRG might not be able to do on their own. And they found they had good partners in them and could give them good strategies on approach. And so we've got a lot of active allies. So we had that whole discussion on, is the IRG just for members of that population, or should it be much broader? And discovered that they really did need the broadness. There needed to be a balance. And so we had to go out and recruit some additional people to the group to kind of balance it out from a population perspective, but that you don't want to overlook those allies who can be very instrumental in the group as well.
Great, thanks for that context, Theresa. The next question we'll address, what are some strategies used to gather buy-in and support from executive leadership and human resources to establish and scale your ERGs? Kristen, would you like to start on this?
Sure. I definitely believe because ERGs have been a hot topic over the last year, with the exposure of social injustices and the need to keep employees engaged while working remote, that it won't be a very difficult conversation to get buy-in and support from leadership right now. But I do think that it's going to be important to approach the conversation and be prepared. You can bring stats. 90% of Fortune 500 companies have ERGs. Explain how it improves the overall business. It increases retention, it increases business innovation, it increases a diverse customer base. I also suggest setting a time frame and measuring your outcomes, especially if it's tied to organizational goals. Compare diverse recruiting stats and retention rates year over year after implementing and including ERGs in conversations to compare where you all started to, to see if what changes and outcomes have come over the years.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Theresa, do you mind jumping in?
Yeah, I can. I was just listening to what Kristen was saying about the metrics piece and the engagement, and that's exactly where we went right away was, how will this really increase engagement? And so last year, added some questions on our engagement survey so that hopefully this year when we measure, now they've only been in place about 8 months, but that we can see the difference. And we know on the front end, we looked at the data and saw that around one question that we had around respect, that the engagement for individuals of color was much lower. We kind of did a pulse survey a little earlier and have seen a slight movement. And now I'm hoping then, by September, we'll see, a much greater increase in that. So I think having those metrics in place can really enhance and make it much easier to sell if you're going to say why you need to continue to have them as well.
Great, thanks, Theresa. Thanks, Kristen. Anything to add from you, Shelli, or you, Roshawn?
So just along the same lines, fortunately, my company is very data driven. So we started very early, just gauging the impact that the networks were having on the company as a whole. And within that, though, we still found that even with the networks that we were finding a bit of, it really opened up the holes that existed within the company and some of the problems that needed to be really faced on a higher level. It was the idea that just because you have an ERG or an affinity network, that maybe that's going to solve the issue, and that's definitely not the way to solve that. And what it actually did was actually bring more awareness to some of the problems that did exist internally. And so it's just really important to make sure you are gauging that awareness so you know just how to move forward with your networks.
Great, thanks, Roshawn. And moving on to the next question, what challenges have you overcome with establishing and scaling employee resource groups within your organization? Roshawn, we'll start with you.
Wow, there's a number of things. Budget, time. Let's start with time. So the best way to describe a new ERG is as like a new startup. So you have this startup, you have this new business that you're having to scale and get established and get buy-in and find people to help run. And the amount of time that it takes to do that is extensive. And so again, these are employee-led groups, which means that you have employees that have full-time jobs that are running these particular networks. So at any given time, I believe at some point I was spending almost like 100 hours a month working on the network outside of my regular job. And so then you run into an issue of how are we going to really get buy-in from these managers, the middle managers in particular. And so they're losing time from their employees that are, on these councils and helping build out these ERGs. And so one of the things that we were facing is, well, one, also, how do we pay people that are hourly employees? Are they able to do outside activities? Will they be paid for it? So there's a lot of things that are not necessarily thought of initially when you're establishing an ERG, and that you do work out somewhat within, in the end, there's really no end. However, these are things to really think about up front. How much time should an employee be spending within this group? How much, which means that how much support should an organization provide these particular employees? What's the budget? Budget's huge. How much budget are we going to provide them? Is there clarity around how the budget can be spent? Who's managing the budget? There's just so many pieces and obstacles to overcome that things really need to be thought out. So I guess I always recommend finding someone who has established an ERG at a company before and really get a clear understanding of what are some of the issues you might run into while establishing this. So yeah, time though, time would be my biggest, the biggest thing for us to overcome.
I totally agree with that, Roshawn. I know one thing, a challenge that I can't even say we have overcome, that we are still dealing with within my organization, is self-IDing and the feeling of exposing if you self-ID, especially with LGBTQ employees or employees who have a disability. Sometimes people just are not prepared to associate themselves with an ERG if they're not ready to self-disclose. So the challenge we've really faced is, even though we're creating ERGs to be more inclusive, we have to already be inclusive, or the employees have to feel that we are inclusive in order for them to feel comfortable enough to self-ID and disclose and want to have a connection to those specific ERGs.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with both of you. I think time is critical, and also the self-ID process. Another challenge I find in scaling ERGs is figuring out how to increase membership and that engagement piece. The return on time invested should always be clear to the members. You want to make sure that it's public to the members what your ERG charter is, the specific annual goals, how that will help in the bigger strategy and actions for your D&I plan. You can offer virtual career development sessions like resume writing or business acumen training. For our organization, that's particularly important. But whatever you choose to do, it must be engaging and fun. And many times we need to also create opportunities for our team members to engage outside of normal work activities. So we mentioned about, how critical it is with, how are they going to find time? But we still have to create an environment where when they do find time, that it's not boring or mundane, or they're not really seeing a benefit from that.
Great, thanks, Shelli. Theresa, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking a little bit. Our problem is a little different because we brought up all of our IRGs in a virtual environment. And, the whole department of ID&E was brought up in a virtual environment. So the connection piece was very, very different. And because we launched these IRGs after all of the focus on racism last year, typically you don't start out when you're trying to implement an ID&E strategy with race, because we know race is the most sensitive topic of them all. And so our IRGs are all really, really strong, and they have been, talking about issues of race and difference. And as a result, the issue that we're struggling with right now and trying to really shift it is that diversity is not only about race and ethnicity or identity, but it's about many factors. And so that's why we're focused on the equitable care and outcomes for all. So it's kind of a unique challenge of when we brought them up. Probably if I had to do it all over again, we would have waited a little while until we kind of got established with what is inclusion, diversity, and equity. And then we could have jumped in, but it didn't happen that way. So now we're having to go back and really make that shift. So I'm not sure if any of you encountered any of that, but that happened as a result of just the timing of when we brought them up.
Great, thanks, Theresa. The next question, I'll throw this to you, Shelli. What would you tell a leader concerned about potential costs associated with creating employee resource groups?
So cost is a big factor, and Roshawn had mentioned a little earlier about budget. So how do you get paid for this is a very common question. And regardless of people, joining in the ERGs or VRGs, that's going to be a primary concern. So the cost or budget question is always best answered in the very early stage of establishing the ERGs. So normally there is a predetermined budget for each business unit, or there may be an overall D&I program budget. A leader would want to make sure that all budget questions are answered before embarking on developing the actions, because those actions are necessary to drive our strategies, right? So most likely there is buy-in from the C-suite already or senior leadership. So funds are already allocated for ERGs and they should be made available. On the other hand, and kind of outside of the budget, I mostly see where most work done for the ERGs or BRGs is by volunteer hours. And people dedicate a lot of their personal time to making sure that that mission that they've either associated themselves as an ally to, or that they're directly impacted by, it's that important to them that they will dedicate those hours as volunteering hours.
Great, thanks, Shelli. Theresa, would you like to add to this?
I think Shelli actually covered it really, really well. The only thing, we started out right away with our budget for them and answered the question around the non-exempt piece. But what we're finding is now our frontline workers can't get time off because of the healthcare worker shortage to attend. And so while we set it up on the front end well, they're still having some challenges being able to engage as well. But definitely, I think if you kind of think through those issues on the front end, it really makes it a lot easier to address.
Great, thanks, Theresa. Roshawn, anything to add to Shelli and Theresa?
Not at this time. It was, yeah, you both hit the nail on the head there.
Okay.
I'll chime in. I actually really agree with what both Shelli and Theresa said. I think that's something that leaders really need to consider, is that it is volunteer-based. So employees aren't getting paid extra to do this. It's something that they're passionate about, or they see kind of the end goal or the importance behind it. So in the grand scheme of things, ERGs don't typically cost a lot of money. I also think that they need to look at it as an investment, the same way that you would pay for training or invest money into different retention or recruiting solutions. They need to approach ERGs the same way, because they're so impactful when it comes to inclusion and the strategic plans of a company overall.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And it looks like we just had a question come in, and it is in the same vein as what we're discussing right now. And the question is, do any of your groups offer a stipend for the leaders of the groups?
So there's no stipend. However, within after a couple years of back and forth over time spent, and to also help the Affinity leaders, network leaders, be able to actually take time to work on projects for the Affinity networks, my company established an actual amount of time that each network member that was in leadership was able to work during work hours on these particular projects and so on. So depending on their position, so for example, if you were the president or vice president of a particular network, you received a bit more time than someone who was a site lead at a particular location. So again, not necessarily a stipend, but allowed time.
We don't have a stipend either, but we have a program called Bravo, which is like an employee appreciation program. And so we're trying to look at how we could allocate dollars annually, at least, to recognize them, and also recognize them in their performance reviews as well. So we're coming up on the end of our first year, but we're already hearing from them. This is a lot of work, a lot of hours. And so how can we, certainly appreciate the fact that it does have that impact without perhaps adding to their salaries, but perhaps finding a way to just show that appreciation in a monetary way to start, and in other ways as well.
Great, thanks everyone. Let's move on to the next question, and Roshawn, I'll hand the mic to you. What are some misconceptions or misperceptions around employee resource groups, and how do you address those issues?
Sure, so initially, some of the issues we ran into, and I feel like these issues are brought up anytime you're working to establish any type of program or group or so on that is attempting to leveling a play field and just building out something that is basically supportive of a marginalized group. One of the issues that we ran into was the idea that it was going to be very exclusive and that they were more clubs that was only exclusive for the person who maybe fit the description or fit within that particular marginalized affinity network, that particular group. And so we ran into questions surrounding the idea that people were going to get particular promotions around it, or that they were going to get special treatment, or that they were basically going to just basically be treated differently than people that are not part of the particular affinity network. And how it was addressed, I think it's something that's still being addressed. I mean, people feel the way they feel. So that's a really hard one. But yeah, that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we actually ran into, is that people were going to be treated, basically get special privileges because they're a part of these particular affinity networks.
I also feel that some people, or a challenge that we were having internally, is that some of the employees felt that they needed to identify with those specific diversity groups in order to join the group. They didn't always consider the allyship aspect of it. So even with our group that's dedicated to women, men felt that they couldn't join, but we actually want them to join, you know, because we want them to learn the experience of women within our organization, as well as how to be better allies or how to better support us within the organization.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And we just had another question come in on the same vein as the question we're discussing right now. How do you combat perceptions that ERGs create disharmony in building community in a predominantly white work environment?
I think it goes back to what Kristen was saying along the lines of allyship. So allyship, again, is super important. So for example, within the Veterans Network, we had more allies than we had actual veterans at the company. And that was necessary in order for us to get more veterans hired within the company. And so what the allyship provides is an ability to get more insight into a particular group that maybe will then help break down any preconceived notions surrounding that group, and also just provide just a bit more insight on how they can best support a particular group. So super important, because we need the allies in order to move forward.
Yeah, I also think a big piece is around communication. I think that when we first launched a lot of our ERGs, we weren't getting the traction that we expected. And it's because of, people assumed that they had to connect or have, a connection with that specific group. So what we actually did after, a few months of not getting the traction that we expected, we did almost like a grand reopening, and we had the company send out communication where our employees could actually just come and learn about our ERGs, what ERGs were available, as well as what exactly they were, and who can join. Just really sharing as much as possible with everyone what they were and what the purpose of them was, to make sure that there were no misconceptions, or so that we were able to tackle some of those concerns that people have.
Great. Thanks, Roshawn, and thanks, Kristen. The next question we'll cover, Theresa, I'm going to throw this to you. Are there any recommendations or best practices to foster workplace belonging through successful employee resource groups, business resource groups, and/or affinity networks?
I think there certainly are. I think last year, we found that our IRGs really wanted to establish that safe space to be able to have conversations following everything that had occurred last year. And so we really promoted that in a pretty major way that, here are these opportunities, here are groups that are here for that. And we found people taking advantage. One of the hardest things that came out of that was that we've been winning best place to work for like 12 years. And then suddenly our IRGs are saying, well, it's not the best place to work for everyone. And so you can imagine the reaction that came from our CEO and senior leaders to say, how could that be, kind of a thing. So we really found that they felt within the IRG, they had that feeling of belonging, that they were being accepted, they were being heard. But when they would go back to their departments, it was a different experience. And so it really allowed us to say, what experience are you really looking to have within your department? Even if you're the only person of color there, how can we help with that? And it opened up opportunities. So this year, we're really working on respect. What does respect look like? Because they're talking about microaggressions. What does respect look like? And how does it look differently from an individual of color perspective in these departments? And it kind of started that dialogue around it so that if they were not getting that feeling of belonging, they got it in the group first and could bring back strategies back to their departments. So we tried to engage them right in the group first. It's safe to talk about these things, and now we can kind of take it out of the group and say, how does that work when it goes back to your actual department? And one of the things that I think I sometimes you don't know if it's making a difference or not. We had someone from our Children's Pride, which is our LGBTQ IRG, say, I really wasn't feeling very respected in my department. But when I go and I'm among people who are just like me in that IRG, it makes me feel different about children's because I feel I have that place where I can relate and I can be a part of things and my ideas are accepted. So, me hearing that says, okay, we've got some work to do in your department. So now let's take it over to the department level. But I think that was probably our best example to say, maybe right now we're not where we want to be, but if these groups can provide that feeling, that safety, that opportunity to be your authentic self as we're in this transition to be more inclusive, then let's allow that to happen.
Great, thanks, Theresa. And Theresa, you mentioned that people of color may express hesitation toward joining an ERG if there are too many allies involved. Could you say more around how you navigate that to increase engagement? And is there such thing as whitewashing an employee resource group?
That's an interesting one. I think, as you heard me say, we had to do a balance. Initially, I think following the death of George Floyd, most of our employees of color were telling us that they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it. They were tired of talking about it. They were tired of educating people about it. And so if these groups were going to be kind of one more time like that, that wasn't what they wanted. And so we had to really do some listening sessions with employees of color to talk to them more about what the advantages were and had the conversation around, are they open to, maybe right now they're having difficulty thinking about allies being in the group. And so maybe we start without, and then we transition to being more open. And that's kind of the transition that not all of them went through. The LGBTQ group was open right away. The Hispanic group was open right away. Our Black professionals group was like, we're not there yet. And so we allowed them to have that time to address some of the issues that were going on. And now they're there as well. So sometimes you have to start where people are and help them transition. But where we saw that there were more allies and individuals from the actual population, we went out specifically to do those listening sessions to understand where and why, and allow those groups just to transition as they felt comfortable.
Great, thanks, Theresa. And we'll cover one more question before we get to the Q&A. And Roshawn, I'll toss this question to you. Why do some employee resource groups, business resource groups, and/or affinity networks fail or lose steam?
I feel like the biggest issue that we faced was the feeling of the lack of support from leadership. In name, there was support, but in action, there wasn't necessarily. So we have an entire equity and belonging team. And while again, we started off as, while we're called again Affinity Networks, we are built out again as BRGs. And so those talks that we would attempt to have in order to try and actually change particular policies internally to try to help influence marketing, et cetera, while in words, they were encouraged, in action, they weren't necessarily. So what I found was that people were spending all this time and putting in all this work to help really try to influence and build a culture where people felt included and a place where people felt like they belonged. However, there wasn't that buy-in across the entire org. And so that's something that we found then became hard to keep leaders. Because you have people that are putting in a lot of time and effort, and then they're not seeing really any change. And so that's a really difficult thing to really see when you're spending so much of your time putting an effort and your heart into these particular organizations, into these particular these efforts that you're working on.
And I want to just add to that and say that what I found was that ERGs are at risk of failing or they lose steam. A lot of it has to do with the organization culture. So if the culture changes and there's a negative culture, bullying, et cetera, that can truly impact the effectiveness of the ERGs. And also sometimes business demands increase. And because it is a volunteer situation, it will pull our team members to other tasks, and it makes it critical for the senior leadership to continue that support. So they have to be very aware of the current workload of their team members and what the overall strategy is so that they're still providing the support that the ERGs need to be successful. Culture is a fluid thing, and organizations, they have to ensure that they continue to exemplify their vision and values. That's critical to make sure that those value statements are actually upheld and people are adhering to them. The last thing you want is to kind of have ethical issues that you need to address because those things end up feeding over into the ERGs. And the team really knows when things are authentic or it's just part of checking the box.
Great, thanks Roshawn and Shelli. We have a follow-up question come in from the audience. Do any of you have experience having to close down an affinity group or employee resource group to the lack of participation by employees? If so, how did you go about it and what was the best way to handle it?
I don't have any experience with having to close an ERG, but I have experienced diminished participation. And some of the things that I just mentioned were contributing factors. Business demand changes, and that can impact the way people show up. It is still their concern, but that's when the D&I leadership has to step in and then facilitate as best they can to continue that mission. And having a clear charter is critical for that, because if you have goals that have been already established, then there are other stakeholders. So if the ERG themselves, they're falling short or people are not able to show up as they intend to, well, there probably is an HR component that has to deal with recruiting, retention, and so on, that you can then tap into their resources to make sure that they continue to do the things that the ERGs they're setting out to do, so their goals. One way that we look at that is also making sure that that goal alignment sticks to our focus areas that tie back to the business. So as long as it does that, then we're already tracking metrics that each entity within the organization ends up having their part to do within that. So how it's set up now, it's when one group may fall short, the ERG, then there are other people that are involved or stakeholders that can continue to drive that initiative or that goal plan so that we can actually still accomplish what they set out to do.
I think it's also important to get to the bottom of things, you know, the same way you would have an exit interview if you left a company, just having conversation, the people that have left the group, reaching out to them and asking them why. And while you are collecting that data, maybe cutting down the amount of time that your ERGs would connect. So if you all are currently meeting monthly, before you completely get rid of the ERG altogether, try quarterly, or instead of meeting in an hour, you know, do 30 minutes until you can figure out why you all are losing participation, and then that should give you the opportunity to re-engage. You know, earlier I mentioned kind of doing a re-grand opening, so doing something similar to that, you know, really making sure that you are introducing all of your employees to those ERGs all over again.
I wanted to add to that too, Kristen, because you triggered a memory. So a lot of times we'll have set leaders for the ERGs. Having backup for those leaders is also a very beneficial tool. So if you have an event lead or initiative lead, like having 2 people who could do that, that helps to manage the workload or the tasks that ERG has. And of course, you may have a co-chair or a primary person that you identify as a president. Having somebody as the backup for that person really does help as well.
Thanks, everyone. We had a question come in from the audience earlier in the event. How do these leaders envision scaling employee resource groups in a remote or virtual environment? What are the pros and cons, challenges, and advantages?
I can take that one. So one of the benefits of being virtual is that I feel you can reach a lot more people. Sometimes when we have a set place, so to speak, unless you're inviting everyone to that place, you can't really reach as many people as you would like to. So communication is important, but you also have to make sure that everyone within your organization is using this, or a majority is using a similar communication medium so they can receive that communication. Because that could also be a disadvantage. Depending on organizations that have different criteria, they may not be able to log into Zoom because they're in secure facilities or varying things. Those things can also impact attendance for webinars and sessions that are beneficial for learning opportunities for development for ERG members. So what I found that was very helpful is commemorating different occasions throughout the year. So in April, it was National Diversity Month. We hosted a month-long series of events, and it was varying topics that we covered, and we had it different times throughout the day. So that way we could meet the attendance requirements for people who are global. And then we also made sure that we recorded it. So if you weren't able to make a session, then you could go to our Microsoft Stream site and then view it on demand. That was one way that we did that. Another way that we made sure that we were gonna reach our team members in this global environment was to also invite through email. So once you were an employee, we started to think of ways, well, if you attended an event that was specific to an ERG, we would invite you and we'd actually put it on your calendar. So you would see a pop-up invite already. You didn't have to go in and log in to register for a particular discussion topic. We made sure that it went out to all the team members, so everyone was aware. That was another way that we could encourage people, subtly, of course, but direct as well, because you would see it pop up on your calendar. And oftentimes we found that people would, there's an event for this ERG going on. I have a few minutes, let me join in. Or they would go to our Microsoft Stream site and then view it. Those are just some of the things that we did. I'm sure someone else probably has something. Theresa?
Yeah, Shelli, no, that's really great. We brought up all of our teams actually the whole strategy remotely. And I think because we've had to work really hard to stay connected. So we've kind of built in a structure where we meet with our co-chairs every month. We meet with the sponsors every other month, and then we meet quarterly with the whole governance structure, which is all the co-chairs and the sponsors and the executives. So it really engaging them to kind of feel what's the issues that are going on, having to follow up. I have 2 program managers, and so they're in the actual IRG meetings so that they can kind of help guide them. So we've just had to be high touch, I think, because of it being remote, because you don't have that ability to bring people together. And now we're hearing that is, when are we going to be able to get together? Well, we just were thinking we'd be able to get together now. And of course, it didn't look like that's going to be the case for quite some time. So I just recently am doing an ERG networking event with a few other healthcare systems here in Milwaukee, just to give people that opportunity to engage and connect even beyond, children's, because they're missing that connectivity in that way. And especially for those groups where we're talking about individuals of color, there's not a lot to start with. So they're really longing that ability to kind of connect even across organizations. So that connection piece has been probably our biggest challenge because we are all working remotely.
Great, thanks, Shelli. Thanks, Theresa. The next question we'll address, are there any good success stories or impactful outcomes you've seen at your company as a result of burgeoning employee resource groups?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some really good outcomes. One was that through our ADAPT network and conversations with our HR department, they've actually changed our benefits, and where any mental health services that are out of network are now considered in network and paid in network. We have our first female Black board member due to conversations with our Billow network, which shouldn't have taken that. However, there was really, through those discussions, it really helped push that hiring process. We've seen a great change in our recruiting practices and how they actually present candidates to the managers. So with each job, they're presenting a more diverse palette of candidates. So definitely a huge change from when I started to the time here. So like in 4 years, it's been a huge transition.
Great, thanks, Roshawn. Oh, go ahead.
I think for my company, and I mentioned it earlier, one of my favorite success stories has just been the access and visibility that it has given the members to leadership. It's put a lot of people in line for promotions or positions, to move up within the company where they may not have had that access before. We're headquartered in Hanover, Maryland, and that's where most of our executives sit. But for someone that's sitting in our Jacksonville, Florida office, who may never have had that chance to connect with leadership, just them being present and presenting, and working with the ERGs, it gave them visibility. And like I mentioned earlier, everyone who is on a committee or a board for our ERGs has actually been promoted in some form or fashion in the last 2 years.
I think the biggest one for my organization was the policy changes. We were able to have the ERGs affect policy changes because that was one of the primary areas that they decided to start from. So they decided, you know what, we're going to look at all the policies in an organization and see what's lacking for our allies of Pride Group or for women or people of color. And we were able to see varying policy changes to incorporate that dimension of diversity and make things a lot more inclusive. And that small change was actually rather large and impactful because so many people then started having a sense of belonging because they could then better identify as themselves at work.
Great, thanks everyone. The last question we're going to get to today is, how do you manage the scope of an employee resource group to be appropriate to the company size and abilities without reducing the importance factor of having an effective employee resource group? We are a small company with limited resources, and I feel that employees will be disappointed that we might not be able to implement all big ideas they may have.
So I always go back to you can't eat an elephant at once. So small accomplishments are really, really critical. We have to step back and really continually evaluate ourselves with the progress that we're making. And it's important that we start with the smaller goals. I'm sure the company's strategy and plan has the bigger imperative, what they're trying to accomplish. But as an ERG, it's important that, especially within the first few months or the first year, that you work on some of those smaller goals. You establish what your mission is and your vision, but you start to tackle things basically in bite sizes. One of the things one of our ERGs focused on was, like I mentioned, looking at the policies. That's something that you can openly share with whether you have a large company or small company. Everyone knows this is what we're working towards changing. Also, probably looking at not just the policy changes, but membership. Be okay with, hey, we increased our membership, and you can do benchmarking for this as well to see, you know, how ERGs scale over time. But it's important that you look at how your membership is increasing as well, and take credit for that. And make those things public to everyone within your organization, so they see the effort that you're putting into it, and they can understand where you are to accomplishing each metric as you go.
Great, thanks, Shelli. And in closing, thank you everyone for joining our event today. And a special thank you to our panelists. Feel free to connect with our speakers via LinkedIn. And also please check out Halo's previous events on our YouTube channel. We will keep everyone updated about our future events moving forward. Halo is hosting a special virtual roundtable event on Tuesday, September 7th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central. We are hosting Marlon Moore, president of Marlon Moore Consulting. He recently released a book called Diversity Starts With You, and we'll be sharing a live recap of his book. And we will be sending out surveys out early next week to get your feedback as we continue to iterate for future events. And really appreciate everyone joining, and hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.